All right, boom, there we go. Today I'm joined by Kate Deering, my coach, who's been helped me out since last August, I believe, with my own health, my own metabolism and thyroid issues. I first heard about Kate on the Strong Sisters podcast with Ashley and Sarah, and then once I read your book, completely changed my perspective on nutrition, metabolism, um, and sometimes I think we forget, or at least I forget, for us immersed in the world of metabolism and such, that a lot of people have never heard of the pro-metabolic approach. A lot of people I talk to don't know really much about the metabolism. They believe sugar's bad, omega-3 supplements are essential, low energy, constipation, poor sleep, hair thinning is all normal stuff. So the goal today is to introduce some of Kate's work, challenge some common health misconceptions, give people some practical ways to improve their metabolism, body composition, and performance. So Kate, thanks for coming on. And for someone discovering you for the first time, could you share a little bit about your background, credentials, kind of the work you do today?
Yeah, well, first, it's an honor to be here, Jack, and you've come a long way. Um, so I've been in the health and fitness world for a good 30 years now, and I have done everything from run health clubs to run boot camps to uh, nutrition coaching. And I started the nutrition path probably about 12, 13 years ago and came from the CHEK Institute and then kind of fell into the bioenergetic space through going to a course through the CHEK Institute. Regardless, it started to make a lot of sense to me, so I started to apply it to myself because I was an athlete, I was a professional, I was in the industry, and I was starting to have my own health issues, and I kept going, "What is going on? I'm doing everything right that I know that I should be doing right," and I seemed to be hitting a lot of roadblocks. So what I was introduced to was basically a different way to look at things. I mean, I think most nutrition spectrums give you that kind of same lens. It's like food, do this, change these food. Whereas kind of the pro-metabolic or bioenergetic space is let's look through in a completely different lens and start looking at different things. And when you start looking at different things like your body temperature and your pulse and how you're sleeping, how your digestion is, for women, how your cycle is, um, are you warm? All of those things start to create different answers and make you make different choices and kind of totally reframe how you're looking at health. And so for me, being in the industry for so long, it totally threw me for a loop because, again, it wasn't how I had always done health. More, it was always about the aesthetics, it was always about the performance, and nothing else seemed to really matter. It was get that way on any cost. And you can do that for a period of time. And then all of a sudden, again, for me, it was in my late 30s where I hit a major roadblock. So from there, I adjusted everything and went down numerous rabbit holes, started studying the work of Dr. Ray Peat on a very deep level. And his work is a little more complex. And so I set out a goal to try to make it a lot easier for people to understand. And that's how the Heal Your Metabolism book got written. And then from there, I went down more rabbit holes and to a deeper level and tried to kind of go into all the questions I'd been asked for the previous 10 years and answer it in the book, Better Energy.
Yeah, I got both of them here. How to heal the metabolism. This is a great one. This is Both of these are super marked up and better energy, both great. People got to check them out. Audiobook too. Um, Speaking of Dr. Ray Peat, how did you first get introduced to his work and when did you start to interact with him?
I got introduced, like I said, through a practitioner through the CHEK Institute. I don't know if you've heard of Josh Rubin. He was starting
Yeah.
to go down that path, and I knew Josh from the CHEK Institute. So uh, I started reading all of Ray's work at that point in time. And then I was like, I just took it all in because I was like, oh my gosh, I have never thought of things this way. Um, Dr. Pete was alive at the time. And if you've ever kind of um, had any email conversion or conversations with Pete, you knew he was very generous with his time. So I shared hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of email conversations with him because I had so many questions. I actually did a few podcasts with him with Kitty Bloomfield.
Mhm.
And so I was allowed to pick his brain. And he's a very interesting individual in the sense that he is very generous with his time, but also when you ask him questions, he would never just specifically give you the answer. He would give you 17 studies, and then he would kind of give you the answer, but he would make you think about what he's telling you. So what it would do, you'd read all the studies, then you would try to make sense of what he was trying to tell you, and then you would, maybe have an additional conversation with him about where he was going with it. But it was such a different, like, again, lens of what I was used to. It challenged my mindset on so many levels that I was like, how is any of this making sense? Because again, I come from a place where to get lean, you give up carbs and sugar is bad and omega-3s are good and, work harder and faster and do more. And that's a hard kind of system to break, especially when you're an athlete. You're just kind of really ingrained in it. And so it usually takes you hitting a wall to make that shift. And that's kind of what happened to me. And I know that's kind of what happened to you.
100%.
Mhm.
Do you remember the point when you realized like you were starting to fix your metabolism? You felt like the first kind of improvements? Because I kind of have like, I remember the first time I took T3 that was non-compounded, and I walk outside and I can see like the leaves clear. Like I felt terrible for so long. And then obviously eating the way you talk about and how to heal your metabolism, but then kind of turning those switches on and then using T3, like it was life changing. Because before then, I mean, it was a dark, hard time for health. So how was your kind of experience getting out of that?
Yeah, you were very dramatic. You went, I can't say that I quite went into the depths that you did, but for me, I basically started just changing my diet. And my biggest thing was I was an overtrainer, an overdoer, overpusher. And it was hard for me to just stop that mentality. So I finally allowed myself to give myself a break and I started to eat more and involve more carbohydrates. Now, I initially felt better and slept better. My cycle was better. What I had a harder issue with was there was some 15, 20 pounds at that point in time that I didn't like. But I was kind of everything to me made sense that this was the right decisions to make. And what really hit me was I actually got injured and couldn't train because that was the last thing I was willing to give up. I wouldn't to do everything else. I would wrestle more, but I was still a pusher. And so I had an injury. And at that point in time, my body, I had to rest. I couldn't do what I was doing. And it was interesting. My body actually dropped about 15 pounds in a couple months just because I think it finally allowed my system to regulate and I wasn't pushing it so hard against each other. And I was like, huh. So it made me realize, oh, more is not better. And allowing yourself to rest and recover at an appropriate level, and then eating what you need to meet your demands is probably a much better way of trying to burn it off excessively by overtraining.
100%. So I guess a good thing that we could start to introduce would be the metabolism because a lot of people hear about it. I don't think a lot of people, especially people I talk to, who are going to be watching this, really understand in depth what we're talking about. So is it how many calories you burn, or how would you kind of explain metabolism to somebody who doesn't really understand it?
So there's a few ways. It certainly could be calorie expenditure on some level, but then you have to differentiate between a healthy metabolism and a stressed metabolism. So from one level, you could say it's, the total, how many calories your body needs to run all the systems properly and to do all the activities that you're going to be doing through the day would equate to energy expenditure. So it's how much energy your body is basically requiring and producing to run all the systems in your body. Okay. We would usually refer to that as basal metabolic rate. And when all systems are running appropriately and you are healthy, then essentially you could say that you have a healthy metabolism because the amount of energy that you are producing is able to keep up with all the systems and functions and things that you want to do throughout the day. We could look at what I refer to as a stress metabolism, which still can actually burn a significant amount of calories. You're just running on different hormones. When you're stressed, you're going to be running on your stress hormones like cortisol, adrenaline. And again, that's coming with an increased calorie expenditure because the demands on your body could be quite high. But what happens with that system is it's very adaptive. And usually, when you have this increased expenditure and maybe you don't have enough input or calories coming in, or you have an issue with converting those calories into energy, you're going to have an adaptive response. And usually, internal functions are going to start to slow down. And that's when you start seeing symptoms like digestive issues, sleep issues, anxiety, depression, hair, PMS, all those start happening because I always tell people your body is always going to prioritize all your external demands versus your internal demands. So if you start doing more, like someone like me or even someone like you, where we like to push hard and we don't have the capacity to either make that energy, we don't have the inputs, meaning we're not eating enough food or the right food, then again, the body's going to have that adaptive response and we are going to start to have symptoms, which is essentially what I had. And I know essentially what you experienced.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is a lot of people have those symptoms, but don't correlate that with a poor metabolism or low thyroid. So how would we then relate the thyroid to the metabolism and some of those issues like constipation, poor sleep, cold hands, low libido, or issues with cycle or thinning hair? Like how would we
Mhm.
relate the metabolism and thyroid?
Yeah, so like what I was stating is the difference with that healthy metabolism and a stress metabolism is a healthy metabolism is run with adequate thyroid hormone.
Mm.
And so lack of thyroid hormone would be a limiting factor to produce enough energy to run your system. It's not the only limiting factor. Food, the amount of food, minerals, nutrients, oxygen, those will all impact your energy production. And so, but thyroid is a big one. And so if someone is low thyroid or has thyroid conversion issues, specifically T3 is your active thyroid. So that is the one that you need. And if you are not, again, producing enough via you have thyroid issues or you have conversion issues for one reason or another, you are going to show up with low energy production, meaning you can't convert your food into energy fast enough to keep up. And so that's going to have an impact on you where if you have lack of energy production, then certain um, uh, systems in your body are going to be impacted. And the ones that are normally impacted are the ones that are normally not essential. Hair growth, nail growth, skin quality, digestion, hormone function. Like you can get away with having poor all of these systems and still live because again, your body's number one job is to keep you alive. It's not for you to procreate, not for you to have a baby, not for you to have a healthy libido, not for you even to have good digestion. It certainly helps to have those things, but those systems are going to be negatively impacted when there isn't enough energy being produced. And so from our standpoint, we're always looking at how can we produce or maximum energy production in a healthy way, meaning supported by thyroid and not by stress hormones. So again, if you are lacking in that, then usually an exogenous thyroid can help, but a lot of times that's not necessary. A lot of times it's just the person isn't eating enough or they don't have enough nutrition or again, they don't have good oxygenation or other things are inhibiting that their ability to produce energy effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something interesting with thyroid that I find is I feel like it's frequently overlooked in modern medicine. Like when I go back and read Dr. Broda Barnes' work, and he talks about, I think, near 40% of the population possibly having hypothyroidism. And now it seems they kind of standard deviated it maybe to 2.5 hypo, 2.5 hyper. But obesity is a big thing. High cholesterol is a big thing. So those markers of poor thyroid function are there. Why do you think it's so overlooked currently?
Because medicine treats the lab and not the person. And so you can certainly show up as normal levels of thyroid. And the other part of it is when you go to a medical doctor, they're usually only going to check your thyroid stimulating hormone, your TSH. And that can be skewed depending on what's going on in your body. Meaning, you usually what they're going to state is you want your TSH to be between 0.5 and 4.5. So I haven't met anybody that has a 4 TSH and actually feels good. But your doctor will be like, you're normal, that's fine. Regardless, you could even have a quite low TSH, and TSH can basically be suppressed in a chronic level of stress. So you might present, the lab can look low, but it could be absolutely suppressed. So you still feel horrible, but it could look totally normal. And so even if they do a more extensive panel and they do free T3 and free T4, again, those numbers can still be in the normal range and somebody not feel good. And so again, it's not doesn't mean this person essentially needs to have thyroid hormone. It means, well, what could they be lacking in the sense of do they need more minerals that support proper thyroid production, or is there something going on that they're not able to have proper thyroid conversion, or is not thyroid at all, but something else is inhibiting this production of energy. Because again, obesity is basically, for a lot of people, it's just excess intake. We know that, right? Today's world is, and honestly, as a whole, we might not actually be eating more calories. We're just eating the wrong calories, and we're certainly more sedentary. So those two things do impact. But when we're eating the wrong calories and we're eating things that actually could inhibit proper thyroid production conversion or even energy production, then even if we're eating the same amount of calories, we're not going to be able to produce the proper or the right amount of energy anymore because it's going to be inhibited. So what ends up going to happening is a lot of those calories that you intake won't be converted into energy, and we'll just store them. So then we're going to produce, excess fat and so forth. So there is a bigger problem going on. It's not just obviously thyroid. It's certainly the food quality. It is just people's lifestyles are completely changed. Our food quality has changed. In the United States, 70% of the food that we eat here is processed. That's problematic, right? And certainly in the medical space or even in some health spaces, they want to let you know that the polyunsaturated fats, the seed oils are totally fine because they do have a cholesterol lowering effect. But they aren't discussing the long-term ramifications of you trying to use that kind of fat as a fuel and what it might be doing and impacting your mitochondria and your cells. It could be impacting energy production. And again, that's the only lens we're looking through. And so everything we look at is how is that process being inhibited for somebody? If they're having symptoms, we're always going to go back to energy production and start unwinding it for that individual so that they can produce more energy. And when you produce more energy, more is going to be available to run your systems appropriately. And your energy production, again, metabolism increases, so your body will be able to intake more fuel and thus eventually start losing weight.
Yeah, so many great tidbits in there. I think about the polyunsaturated fats, which is so fascinating, right? You mentioned in your book, Better Energy, about the LA Veterans trial, the Sydney trial, the Minnesota trials, where it's longer term polyunsaturated fat studies, because this is probably the number one thing I talk about too with people who are overweight initially. And when they cut them out, you can see their body temperature and heart rate, which are kind of two markers maybe at home you can utilize other than TSH and all those blood labs, but seeing low heart rate, possibly low temperature. But those polyunsaturated fats, can you explain some of those experiments, the Burr experiment? There's many long-term experiments that a lot of times are just neglected completely by modern medicine. And we're able to see polyunsaturated fats slow down metabolism in humans and in animals.
So when we analyze kind of what right, and so the polyunsaturated fat, most people know them, or a type of seed oil. Seed oils are polyunsaturated fats. There are additional polyunsaturated fats, but those are definitely ones that are in the modern diet that people tend to eat. And it has definitely changed in the last 50, 60 years in the American diet and other people's diets. We've added these liquid fats into our food. Those are soy oil, canola oil, sesame, sunflower oil. They're basically oils from seeds that now we use to put in our foods. And the medical space, what they'll tell you is that these oils lower cholesterol. And they do lower cholesterol. That is a true statement. And in short-term trials, when you just isolate for that outcome, and we're looking at heart outcomes or we're looking at cholesterol outcomes, they basically produce a positive result because they'll go, we've changed, we've exchanged saturated fats for PUFA oils. And when they do that, they see better outcomes. Well, these people's cholesterol lowered. And in shorter term, and in people that actually, well, I should say even 2 or 3 years, but people that have previous heart issues that are already having cardiovascular events, there does seem to be less heart issues in the next 2 to 3 years if they exchange the poly or saturated fats for polyunsaturated fats. So in that short term, maybe there is benefits. And maybe, again, if we only look at cholesterol lowering kind of results, then we would say that's a positive thing. And that's primarily what they're looking for. Now, we have a handful of trials that do kind of follow people longer term. And what we have found is the longer we kind of we follow these people, the additional other things that start to happen to people that are on the polyunsaturated fat, meaning there's more cancer, there's deaths for other reasons. And so yes, maybe it's good in the short term, but the longer we do it, we find that there's more problems. And so considering that, we've been now consuming these oils for 50 or 60 years at a much higher amount, from our perspective, it is impacting how people are basically able to convert energy, which is impacting their weight, impacting their health, impacting other things that are going on in their systems. Essentially, it's impacting energy production. Do we have clear randomized controlled trials for long periods of time in humans that just control for this variable? Not really. It's you're not going to see human trials extended out that long for something like this. It's too expensive, it's too long. We're just not going to do it. So for the most part, we're assuming that these people that are on these diets, they're basically still doing them, and we're kind of observing those factors. So the other thing that we can look at then in kind of rat and mouse studies is what are these doing to these animals short term? And again, humans aren't rats, but we can learn from them because at least we can control in these studies. We can actually control all their environments. We can do it for a year. We can see what's happening. And then, of course, we can then kill the animal and decide what's basically going on. Sad, but at least we can see kind of mechanistically what's happening when we exchange these fats. And we certainly see on how the fats react. Like polyunsaturated fats, when they're used as energy, produce a lot of toxic byproducts that can kind of muck up your mitochondria and kind of inhibit energy production. And so, as I refer to it, it's like a slow drip in your system. It's not impacting very quickly, and that's why we can't really see it. And just to give you an example, like I can create a study where I can give one group a pack of cigarettes a day and say, for the next 90 days, you're going to smoke a pack of cigarettes. And that's it. You're going to do everything else the same. And this other group, you're not going to smoke a pack of cigarettes. And then we're going to look at health outcomes at the end of that 3 months. Well, probably the ones that actually smoke the pack of cigarettes are going to weigh less because it's an appetite suppressant. And they might actually think more clear because it's a stimulant. And so they're going to have more, they'll be marked as, oh, I feel sharper and I lost 15 pounds. Whereas the other group did not. Now, we're not going to see the other negative impacts in that short period of time from smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. So if I was going to make a conclusion, I'd be like, cigarettes are healthy for you because they help you lose weight and they help with cognition. So we can do anything short term and decide that, right, that can have a positive impact. However, what we don't have the best data on is the longer term implications. And like I said, the polyunsaturated fats impact is much more of a drip on our systems than something that's going to respond quickly. And we have to kind of gather, again, we're kind of gathering what has changed in the American diet. We're gathering what is it doing mechanistically in the system. And we're also gathering the data and the studies that we do have and what are they seeing. And we are seeing that the longer term data on these, like I said, the LA veteran style or the Sydney, that there are more causes of death from other things besides just heart issues when somebody is on a higher PUFA diet.
Yeah, there's a lot behind it. And then, the Burr study where they kind of, it seems you talk about it, and then Ray talks about it in one of his articles, how they kind of mistakenly miss some B vitamins and possibly zinc, as they say omega-3 and omega-6s are essential, which they're still in animal fats and other fats, and the daily need for them are pretty low. But then you talk about meat acid and how that's created, and a lot of other processes behind that. But then you also went into how vitamin E can be beneficial. I think this is one of the maybe the best supplements that somebody can utilize if they're starting to lose fat or if they're starting to detox off of the PUFAs. How does the vitamin E work? And I know there's a lot of different kinds of vitamin E.
So I'll just kind of go back a little bit. And I think
Yeah.
you're referring to George and Mildred Burrs.
Yeah.
They did a study a long time ago about the essential fatty acids, because of course all of us were told the omega-3 and omega-6 are essential, and they are in very, very small amounts. You do need some, okay? It is
Yeah.
absolutely impossible to not have them in your diet. I mean, eggs have them, oyster, even if you ate completely 100% biogenic, you're still going to get them, and they're in everything. And so you can't avoid them. But you don't need copious amounts of fish oil and additional amounts in your diet. But what they found is that they took the essential fatty acids out in animal studies and found that they had all of these symptoms. Animals had skin issues and so forth in the diets they were given them. But what they later realized is that those diets that they were giving the animals were lacking in B vitamins. And what the essential fatty acids did, they actually slowed down the metabolism of the animals. And so when you have a slower metabolism, your needs for nutrients decreases. Your needs for everything decreases. And so you have a slower metabolism, the demands go down, less nutrition. And so what happened was the ones that were getting the essential fatty acids needed less nutrition. And so they didn't have a poor response. And so the ones that they depleted the essential fatty acids from, the metabolism increased. And so their need for nutrients, specifically the B vitamins, went up. And so it was actually the lack of B vitamins that was creating the problems, not the fact that they didn't have the essential fatty acids. So that was redone years later, and they said, oh, no, this is actually a B vitamin deficiency. So, but for whatever reason, they still refer back to Mildred and George Burns as, look, this is the reasons we need essential fatty acids. And again, I'm not saying that we don't. We do, but very, very small amounts. Um, so getting back to vitamin E is an antioxidant. The PUFA oils are a high oxidative oil. So the vitamin E can be quite protective when your body chooses. So when you lose fat, we don't know specifically what your body fat is. It's going to be a combination of the polyunsaturated fats, monounsaturated, saturated fats. And if you've had a diet that was high in polyunsaturated fats, and of course, those are found in all these seed oils, but they're also found in nuts and seeds. And so if somebody was consuming a lot of those things prior, then we can assume that probably your fat is going to have a higher percentage of the PUFA oils. Naturally, your body actually doesn't want to burn those oils. It understands that they're dangerous and that they produce toxic byproducts. So normally the body will try to store them. And so when someone does go into a deficit or tries to lose body fat, your body's going to release that fat into the blood. And for you to get rid of it, you have to burn it. So it's optimal to do it at a very slow rate, right? This is why massive fat loss quickly is usually not ideal. Certainly if you're coming from a diet that was certainly high in polyunsaturated fats. What we have shown and what Dr. Peat would normally say is the body, even if it doesn't lose weight, but it'll take the body about 4 years to change the composition of the fat in your fat. Meaning, if you're the exact same weight and you don't actually try to go into a deficit, but you change your diet and now you're consuming more saturated fats to PUFAs, then over that 4 year period, the body will try to change out that PUFA fat slowly so that after 4 years, you would have minimal PUFA storage, even if you didn't lose any weight. And so that's why a lot of race work, and this was in the beginning always like it took me a while to wrap my head around because a lot of what he talked about was inhibiting fats from going into the blood. He was always about inhibiting fat loss, inhibiting free fatty acids from entering. And I'm like, but wait a minute, what about everybody? Right? Don't we all want to lose weight? And his entire reasoning was because it was going to be damaging. And so you want to do it very slow and steady. And again, if you do start releasing fat into the blood, one of the things to take is the vitamin E because it offers some pro-oxidant or antioxidant benefits to help with when your body does oxidize that PUFA oils to be protective.
Yeah, well said. And that's something I didn't realize until probably about a year ago, where I heard you on a podcast, read your book, and then emailed you desperately. And was like, I need help. I'm realizing my metabolism is destroyed. I was eating PUFAs, thinking they were healthy, downing fish oil, nuts, seeds, all these things. So I think it'd be good to pivot maybe to kind of how we reversed mostly what I was dealing with, because I think a lot of people in some capacity might be dealing with something similar, especially if they're maybe looking to lose fat and they've been eating the standard American diet and are high stress individuals, like many athletes and such who I talk to. So when we first started working together, what were the signs that stood out to you that this guy's metabolism is not doing well?
Well, I think you probably should explain to your listeners your
Yeah.
previous few years because I mean, just listening to your health history and your history, kind of like, okay, first I needed to understand your personality. And and so once you started explaining to me your history, right? Now, understand that Jack sent me a pile of
It was
labs and
50-page PDF.
tests. Yeah, I was like, hold on. I go, this is going to take a while, right? Like every lab and test under the planet, because the poor guy had been everywhere. And unfortunately, they haven't kind of taken all of this in consideration. And this is what I will say, and I'm sure you probably get this too, is in today's world, if you go to your doctor, they are very specific. You go to a GP and you have an issue, and they're like, "Well, you need to go to urologist, or you need to go to a cardiologist, or you need to go to whoever." It becomes a little bit of a mind fuck because you end up talking to 10 different people, and they're all giving you a different perspective, and they're not actually putting the entire picture together for you, which is exhausting. And so, what we like to do is kind of get a general picture of everything that's going on with you. Okay, let me see your labs. That's one part, but let me understand who you are as a person to see why we got to this place. And so I'll let Jack tell you kind of what had been going on in his life and maybe the previous few years about what he was doing, because I think that will give people some context of what was going on.
Yes, that's a that's a good idea. I haven't really shared much of this, so this is good.
Hmm.
Um, so I played a little background on myself. I played college football for 6 years and constantly was a chronic undersleeper. We had to wake up at 5 a.m. for workouts. So I'm sleeping maybe 5 to 6 hours a night on average for 6 years. Very high stress. Um, by the end of my career, I incurred a lot of injuries, shoulders, back, all this stuff. So I was using different painkillers and such. And and then by the end of the career, energy started to come down. I had mononucleosis. I had a lot of just weird um, kind of feelings of health, right? My family had a history of thyroid, but I didn't realize at the time. It's kind of what I was dealing with. I was cold, even though I was 300 pounds, which was odd because early in my career, my roommates would be like, "Hey, close the window." It'd be wintertime in Buffalo, snowing, and I was warm. And then slowly throughout my career, I was cold. I had a girlfriend at the time, and I was freezing all the time. I remember wearing a winter hat and such. So after my career, I went from about 305 to maybe 225. So I lost 80 pounds in 6 months. And I did that without knowing all the things we're talking about today. So I did it. I started out a first month of carnivore. So no, no carbohydrates, running strictly on cortisol, adrenaline, glucagon. From there, I transitioned into, I think, OMAD, one meal a day. And then later on transitioned into intermittent fasting. And throughout this time period, having a lot of, nuts, seeds, a lot of salads, raw cruciferous vegetables, which disrupted my digestion. So at that point, I lost my weight after football and I didn't feel right. So I started going to the doctor. I was cold. My libido was low. My testosterone was under 200, total testosterone, under 200 nanograms deciliters. So that was very low. Free T was low. And I didn't want to go on TRT because I'm like, I'm 23 years old, and my digestion was terrible. So I had to get a colonoscopy, endoscopy, GI maps. I had mold exposure, heavy metal toxicity, SIBO, leaky gut dysbiosis, all that stuff, which was not fun. But I didn't know how to, really to go about that at the time. And then continuing onward, I just kind of kept pushing through. They looked at the GI map. They're like, I guess you're good, even though you're either having diarrhea or you can't go to the bathroom for 3 or 4 days. And so I just kind of toughed it out the whole time I was working out. And then eventually I went to coach college football. So this was in 2023 and just continued stressing myself. I wanted to get leaner than I've ever been before. So I did, about 2,000 calories per day, weighing about 220. And then on Sunday, I wouldn't eat. So I'd fast full day. Then that was about 6 months. And still couldn't figure out what's going on. I went to the doctor because I felt sick and tired and depressed. And they're trying to give me whatever SSRIs or other medications. And I'm like, I don't want to use I know something else is deeper, when you know you're ill, but the person doesn't understand it. And this is how I felt for years. So it was going to person. Uh, and then I went to a clinic, and the first time I kind of got any help, I went to a kind of a TRT clinic, and they gave me HCG. So I used that twice a week, injections to get my testosterone up, and that luckily helped. So my testosterone started going up, but I still felt really cold. and off. And I didn't know really what to do. I wanted to get into fitness, so I became a trainer, a high school strength coach, nutritionist. And then I was bored, and you were talking about personality wise, I like adrenaline. So I went out and moved to Oregon to do wildland firefighting. And that diet was full of PUFAs. We're having whatever they give us, Oreos or freaking, roast beef sandwiches on bad bread or who knows what. Yeah, a lot of stuff, you don't go cook your own food for 2 to 3 weeks at a time. So you're just kind of getting whatever is given to you. And and at that point, I was going to stay in Oregon, and this was kind of like the first rock bottom or one of them for health, I felt. And I was so fatigued. I would come back from fires and I would sleep a good 15, 18 hours for a couple days in a row. And I didn't know, you know, what was going on. I just had no energy. I was felt terrible. So I moved back home, talked to my doctor, who's happened to be the Bills team doctor at the time, and I started just getting a bunch of tests. Did a full body MRI at the time too, because I was trying to figure out what's going on. Realized I had a bunch of benign tumors all over in the brain, thyroid, uh, lungs, kidneys, wherever. So later on, it was obviously from chronic stress. And then going forward, uh, started working with a clinic, kind of a functional medicine. I know you talk about these a lot, which, you know, we, I got tested for a bunch of stuff. This is when I got the GI map, urine report and stuff. And at the time, I did a bunch of antifungals, antibiotics, but I was on a very calorie restrictive diet, maybe 2,600. I think training day was 2,600, 2,200 calories. It was non-training day. So for me, being 6'3", 225, 230, that was not a lot of food. And I just started to feel worse and worse. Digestion kept getting worse. I had to go to the emergency room a bunch of times for kind of chest pain and other issues. So eventually, that's when I got introduced to your work, and I was ready to kind of do whatever I needed to do, which took some time because I had to stop
Mhm.
working out for a while and uh, sleep more. So I guess that's kind of the background. It took a while to get there.
And Jack is not, I mean, obviously I related to Jack because I have kind of an extreme personality. He has an extreme personality, which can be very beneficial for a lot of things, except when your health starts to go. And so with Jack, it was very extreme from let me go all out, train or be a firefighter or whatever. And the nutrition wasn't supporting him during that time period. So eventually it was going to break. And it did break. And when it broke, he then had to sleep 14, 15 hours a day, do nothing, not work at all, and he would just bounce back to these extremes, which obviously is not very functional and you can't live that way. And so, when I think I met you, you were eating, I don't know, 2022. I think you'd lost the weight. And it was a slow, progressive process of getting you to eat a lot more and more and more. And eventually, I think we got you what, 5 or 6 thousand calories.
Yeah, over 6,000 a day.
Mhm.
It was fun.
And also with him finding for him the right thyroid combination that was going to be work. Because I think at some point you had tried it before, but I think you weren't eating enough and
It
you
was
didn't,
compounded. So
yeah,
I
it was
think it
the
was
wrong
only the
time.
T4 worked. Yeah.
Yeah. So he was fortunate enough to have a doctor that would experiment and give him what he needed, which unfortunately some don't. You have to kind of like figure out that pathway, which can be a little bit complex. But you were fortunate, and along with the increased caloric intake, and kind of, again, as I always say, meeting your body where it's at, not trying to push it. Again, when you have a personality, specifically if you're an athlete, you usually do have a personality that you have a very strong mindset to push through things. And in some contexts, that's good, and in others, it's not. And specifically when you start to have injury and or you're starting to have metabolic issues, you can push very, very hard if you are supported nutritionally. And if you're young, you can also push really hard with not that great of a nutrition, but you're eventually going to have a lot of injuries. You're eventually going to, totally burn out. Something is going to happen to you. The combination together will allow you to be a strong athlete or performer or whatever, and to not go through those dips because the dips suck. And, but when you are that extreme, you go to the push, you will push hard, hard, hard. You will start to go into that adrenaline cortisol state, which can
Mhm.
actually feel pretty good for a while. And then you will crash and burn. And then you will have to go through full recovery, try to recover. And then, if you don't know how to kind of stabilize yourself and build it up, you're going to just repeat that, which was kind of what was happening to you. And now, how are you doing?
Great. Yeah, feeling good. Still eating over 4,000 calories, but kind of mid 220s to 230. So, um, taking my time getting down, to not, cause any issues here. So being patient, but feeling great. And I think that's something a lot of people don't realize kind of in this process, even if they're not dealing with all of those health issues, that they call it Hashimoto's thyroiditis. Some people a lot of people kind of got diagnosed with that, and then they only get prescribed T4, levothyroxine, and they don't change anything about diet, and they don't really notice any improvements. So behind the scenes, it takes a lot more. We played around with a lot of other supplements for digestion or other things to help out. Um, I guess when you reintroduce that much food, because we did it slowly, like for a lot of people, how do you explain to them, look, if you want to lose weight, you're going to actually have to increase your basal metabolic rate, reduce your training, and then eventually we'll increase your training, increase your NEAT, but it kind of takes time. How do you, uh, go about that as a coach? Because you have a few great stories in the book, Better Energy and How to Heal Your Metabolism, about doing that with people.
Yeah, and it kind of, as I was telling you in my own epiphany, it was what took me to kind of reduce my own training to have a positive response. I mean, because if you had a belief system, specifically if you've been in this industry for a few decades like I had, it was very ingrained, and you're very heavily believed. And I mean, that's just how we work, is like even when we know it's not working, we kind of double and triple down on it because we're so invested into that philosophy. We see that in a lot of things in today's world. But ultimately, it takes your ability to kind of say, you know what, maybe what I'm doing isn't working. Maybe I completely need to change what I'm doing. And from that part, you go, look, we have to kind of fix you in a space like it's hard to fix you when you're in a hyper stress adrenaline state. We're just kind of running over here. We have to get you out of that state first. And to get you out of that high stress state, we got to reduce the demands on your system while trying to support you with enough nutrition or nutrients to help kind of meet your body where it's at. Now, for some people, sometimes it's just you got to bring stuff down. You got to bring the demands down. Maybe you have to reduce the training and then kind of build it up from there. For a lot of individuals, I know you work with a lot of male athletes, and I would assume some females, as you get older, it can be more challenging, meaning to just increase calories and also reduce training, because if you do it too quickly, somebody's going to gain a significant amount of weight. So first and foremost, you're like, look, we need to increase your demands. We need to make sure and we're going to look at different things like your sleep, your digestion, your hormone function. Like those things need to improve. And if they start to improve, we know that your body is now using the energy it's creating to fund those things. So we have to support those systems because, again, your body will always prioritize the external demands, your work, your workouts, stress, your home life, whatever, versus your internal demands, which is running all your systems like digestion, circulation, detoxification. And it's kind of like it's going to take from Peter to pay Paul if there's only a certain amount of energy being created. And so that means we got to bring that stress or those demands down so that we can now support the system so that they now have enough energy to run optimally. Once your symptoms improve, then we can work on, okay, can we now add a little bit more calories and do a little bit more, right? Because there's obviously lots of benefits with training and training hard, right? Some adaptations are good, being fitter, stronger, having more muscle. Those are good adaptations. However, they still take more energy to do that. It's a very energetic process to build muscle. If you don't have enough fuel coming in or enough protein or nutrients coming in, your body will not prioritize that. It's going to say like, no, you can do all you want. We're not going to do it. It's not going to be happening. And I see that constantly in people that are under fueling themselves. They train really hard, they don't get stronger. And if they do it too hard, they actually start to get weaker. And so we have to always take both of those things into consideration and with also understanding your life, because if your life is incredibly stressful, you're being pulled in 50 different directions, then again, we have to assess like, is this a good time for someone to be put into a deficit to try to lose weight? Normally, no. Normally, look, we need to just keep you going right now. And we need to adjust your nutrition. And again, sometimes it's just changing the diet that they're currently consuming, right? If somebody's eating just a poor diet, processed foods, a lot of PUFA, um, low nutrients, we could give them the exact same amount of calories with better nutrition, and they're going to have a substantial better result. So that's always the first thing you start to do with somebody. But again, if they're someone who's actually really, really cold and is under energized, then again, we got to take those demands down. And then we have to look, is nutrition enough to pull that temp and pulse up? Does this person actually need some exogenous thyroid, or is there something else going on that's kind of inhibiting this process?
Yeah, absolutely. And so many athletes were told to have super low heart rate. You were a distance athlete, and I wasn't, but I was going to the doctor before I started working with you, and my heart rate was under 30 beats per minute, resting or waking. And they're like, "Oh, you're in great shape." I'm like, "No, I haven't, I haven't done cardio in months." But how do you explain like, that aspect of the low heart rate in these hyper trained athletes? Maybe we would argue overtrained, or you know hypometabolic. How does that happen, and why does it happen?
Yeah, I mean, good question. Low heart rate is a sign of efficiency. And for some sports, efficiency is good, right? If you're going to have to bike 100 miles, you kind of want to be efficient. You don't want to actually have to eat every 30 minutes to keep up and, because that's going to slow you down. So that efficiency is going to happen. Long distance runners, same thing. They're going to have very low heart rates, and they're going to be incredibly efficient for their sport because it's going to be advantageous to that. Now, does that mean it's beneficial for their overall health and metabolism? Not necessarily, right? There is going to have an impact there. That's right. So I think we always have to kind of differentiate because super high heart rate is not necessarily better either. But when we look in just the context of a healthy metabolism and optimizing energy production without having to do excessive amounts of exercise to burn more calories, then it's more optimal to have a heart rate around 75, 85, 90 beats per minute. A lot of people might say that's too high, and it can be if there's not enough nutrition going in, right? If you don't, and someone is significantly losing too much weight, that could be excessive. They have to be met, meaning if you optimize metabolism and you increase energy production, then you need to also increase nutrition and fuel, unless you're doing a strategic deficit, but you still got to worry about the nutrition. And that's why you shouldn't always be in a deficit, because again, your body will essentially adapt to that. But you want both things. You want to make sure that again the fuel's there. You want to make sure the nutrition is there, so that that person is optimized through this process.
Absolutely. And then I think this is a good time to kind of dive into carbs and sugar too, because this is another misconception and something I didn't really understand when I lost weight. But when we got my calories up to 6,000, uh, carbs were very high, probably well over 600, sometimes nearing 1,000 a day, maintaining under 240 typically, sometimes higher. But I guess, how can we explain how carbohydrates and sugar help thyroid create more CO2 in the body? Like, what's the process behind that? How do you explain to somebody that carbohydrates are actually helpful for their health?
So in the human body, we have two main fuel sources, fats and carbs. Protein can also be used as a fuel. It's just not your optimal fuel. Protein is mostly used for structure, hormones, bones, muscles, so forth. So again, we can certainly use protein as an energy source. It's just not preferred. So that leads us with carbs and fat. And at any point of the day, your body is using both of those. You're never just 100% carb or 100% fat. You're always using both. Your systems are choosing what to utilize depending on what's going on in your body. Now, there's certain systems in your body that can only utilize carbohydrates. One of those are your red blood cells because they do not have mitochondria, and so they only can go through glycolysis, which is an anaerobic state. So they only can use carbs, they cannot use fat. And it would make sense because when you actually go into aerobic respiration, you require oxygen. And because your red blood cells are transporting oxygen, we don't want them to use what they're transporting. So they're designed that way. Your nervous system is also going to prefer using carbohydrates. It can't use fat or protein either, although it can use ketones, and ketones can be created from fat. So they're just, like I said, there's certain systems that are going to be run more efficiently when they're carbohydrate usage. But because your body's, like I said, always using both, it depends on a few things. When you go into more activities, you're going to use carbohydrates at a higher rate. The reason is that actually convert them into energy faster than fats. It's a quicker process for you to turn a glucose molecule into ATP or energy. It is just a faster process. So when stress goes up or when you have more activity, you'll start relying more on that fuel source. When you are resting or sleeping, you'll actually utilize fats at a higher rate because it's a slower fuel source. It doesn't take it takes a longer time for you to convert that energy. So it would make more sense when that you don't need fuel as fast or energy as fast that we would rely on that fuel source. So getting back to like you utilizing more carbohydrates, it's because again, we're quickly using this fuel source. And so the systems of your body that are requiring energy on a day-to-day basis, again, can use both, but they want that quicker fuel source. And when we oxidize or utilize carbohydrates and convert them into energy, we do produce 50% more carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is important because it's needed to help get oxygen into the cell. And it also can be used as your primary vasodilator to help open up your blood vessels. And it also can actually be used as an antioxidant. So it has multiple benefits for producing more carbon dioxide, but primarily it's because you want oxygen to get into the cell because it helps the system keep moving and producing more energy. And that's why you breathe. The entire reason you breathe is to have oxygen into the cell, to basically accept the final electron and to keep the entire system moving. And that's what carbon dioxide does. And again, carbohydrates will produce 50% more. They also, in the liver, you need carbohydrates to help convert your inactive thyroid into active T3. So that's why we see in a lot of people that are on very low carbohydrate, keto-based diets or even carnivore, that their T3 production actually goes down. And so they actually, at least in the short term, produce a slight hypothyroid state because they don't have enough glucose. Eventually, their body will go through more gluconeogenesis and produce their own glucose so that that process could eventually occur. But that, again, comes under the guise of stress. And so, we've always been taught that glucose is very protein sparing because the point is that if you need glucose, you either need to get it from the carbohydrates or you're going to have to go through a process called gluconeogenesis, where you actually convert your non-carbohydrate sources into glucose. Fat is not one of those, other than the glycerol molecule in a triglyceride. But primarily, your body's going to start converting protein or your own muscle tissue into glucose to keep up with those demands. So although you can survive on a zero carbohydrate diet, you can't survive on zero glucose. You'll die. So carbs or glucose are so essential to the human body that we have a system that will make our own if we're lacking in it. And so that's why they're so important. And again, when we look at efficiency and we look at high metabolism, it is very glucose run because it's just a quicker energy source. And again, it produces more carbon dioxide, it supports thyroid conversion, all of the things that are actually going to keep you in a healthy metabolic state. And so when we run through that, and so when we become a better glucose user and we run that at a high rate, we actually become a better fat burner because the higher amount of metabolic or higher amount that our metabolism is running, when we are at rest, we will burn more fat essentially. So by increasing metabolic rate, specifically run primarily by carbohydrates, at least in that higher state, you'll pull everything up. And so that's why that process works the best and not trying to actually force the body to or just give it only fat, because by doing that, now you're inhibiting these processes, right? You're inhibiting thyroid conversion, you're lowering carbon dioxide production, and you're actually now trying to burn a slower fuel source even under stress. And again, that's going to exacerbate the stress process.
Yeah, that's a ton of info and that's super helpful. And I think when somebody's now after hearing you explain that, they're bought in, they want to add carbs. Now, what people tend to forget, and you've written about this numerous times, is people forget to look at the total calorie intake and specifically the fat intake when they're reintroducing carbohydrates. Do you mind kind of explaining the importance of pulling fat down and even a little bit of the Randall cycle and how having a super high fat meal, super high carb meal might not be ideal for improving the metabolism?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, in the context of certainly when you're trying to establish a caloric maintenance, so maybe initially we're trying to go, look, we maybe need to change the macronutrient ratio, or maybe we need to pull your demands down. But in that process, we don't really want you to gain a bunch of weight. So you don't want to automatically just say, hey, you're under eating, let's double your calories, right? Like you were under eating, but your system couldn't have handled double the calories initially, but you also just would have gained an obscene amount of weight and quickly, and that can actually not make you feel any better, might make you feel worse. So initially, we want to establish, okay, where is your calorie maintenance, and what can you eat and maintain your weight? With specifically, if we start lowering your demands. So when we look at that, because again, we're trying to prioritize the carbohydrates in your system. Um, what a lot of people do initially, they're like, oh, carbs are good. And maybe they've come from a keto-based or carnivore-based diet and they were eating 2,000 calories. And all of a sudden they're like, well, I'm now going to just add 1,000 calories of carbohydrates because they're good and it's going to increase my metabolism. And all of a sudden they gain 10 pounds in a month because they've just increased their actual intake by 1,000 calories without adjusting for like what their maintenance actually is. Well, that's not going to have a good result. So usually we have to go specifically if you were on a high fat diet and like, look, we've got it while we increase the carbs to keep you at your maintenance calories, we're going to actually lower your fat. Or for some people, they actually need to lower their protein because they could be eating excessive amounts of protein, specifically in today's world, and specifically with a lot of athletes. They're over protein themselves. So we look at those. I'm like, look, we're going to have to lower these things where we start to increase your carbohydrates so that we can support the system effectively without you gaining a ton of weight. That's going to be a very important process through this so that, again, that person doesn't overly shoot, which we see all the time, and to not just think that just by adding carbs, you're all of a sudden going to have this high metabolic rate and all is going to be well in the world. It does need to be done in a kind of meticulous, like in a way that's going to help the system gradually shift. We don't want to bombard it with too much initially.
Yeah, absolutely. And then speaking of athletes on this, for carbohydrates, you talk about this in how to heal your metabolism, but the importance of an intra-training drink, especially if somebody's pushing hard, and having carbohydrates, maybe some salt during training for liver glycogen. Why is that important? How does that help somebody if they're a high performer?
Well, like anything, I mean, your muscles can, I think, store up to about 2,000 calories, and probably if you have more muscle, you'll store more. So if somebody is training really, really hard and they're depleting that, then having some additional carbs or salt during that process is going to help them with the performance, specifically if it's a long training session. So you're
Mhm.
basically just giving yourself more intake or more fuel to run those systems as your body starts to become depleted of your primary fuel source. I would say if your workout is less than an hour, even if it's fairly intense, it's not necessary if as long as you're properly fueled before the workout. Some people like to stay more hydrated. Some people sweat a lot during that process, so having additional salt would be helpful. But if it's probably under an hour, it's probably not totally necessary, and then I would just have some sort of food after the fact. But if you're doing a longer training session, then yes, having some calories and you can have pure, juice or sugars or whatever during that process because all your body's going to do is just utilize it. It's going to burn right through it. It's going to keep able, and it's going to give you that primary fuel source when you're in that intense state to keep going. Anyone that's done longer training sessions and hasn't properly fueled. You hear that with people that run marathons and they don't eat enough and they don't carbohydrate, they bonk. And all of a sudden, the muscles are like, we're out of fuel, now we're done. And they can barely walk, and that's a true thing. But if you properly fuel during that process, that's not going to happen. And so it's just another way. For me personally, I always feel better when I have a drink. I don't always need to do it. Some people, like I said, you don't have to do it. Some people don't want to have a juice water kind of drink. But if, in my opinion, I can perform better longer with some sort of supplemental sugars or salt during that process.
Yeah, I'm the same way. And every client I have, whether they've been like NFL players or college football players or just regular people, they always feel better when they have it's usually orange juice, vanilla collagen, baking soda. I like to do the orange cream skull shake, and People love it. And then speaking of carbohydrates and times possibly under stress, this is something when it regards to sleep that I don't think a lot of people realize is how helpful carbohydrates before bed can be, especially with calcium and sugar and salt, kind of that combo you talk about. What's the importance of carbohydrates before bed? How can it help reduce the stress response and maybe improve somebody's sleep if they're struggling to sleep?
Hmm. So we have to remember that sleep is actually a high energy state. And people that do not have or more in a stress metabolism or are in a hypothyroid state normally do not report sleeping well. They actually can't get into that deep state of sleep. And so a lot of it is their body is hyper responding. It's in a hyperadrenaline state. It's having too hard of a time to even come down from that state. Is literally living on stress hormones. And so when you go to bed, you're just kind of wired still because those stress hormones are still elevated. That's been what you've been running on all day. So carbohydrates in and of themselves can lower the stress response. And the reason for that is when your stress hormones are elevated, one of the primary jobs of those stress hormones are to raise blood sugar. They're elevated because your body is saying, we don't have enough quick fuel. We need more fuel. So those hormones will elevate to try to break something down or tell your liver to produce more glucose and dump it into your blood because the body's signaling is we need to create more energy and we need carbohydrates and you don't have any coming in. And so we're going to elevate those hormones to have that happen, right? Your hormones are basically, they're just messengers telling your body to do stuff. And like I said, two of cortisol's and adrenaline's main jobs are telling the body to dump fuel, fat or carbs, into the blood so the cells can use it. Your cells are basically little factories and they're running 24 hours a day. They need fuel 24 hours a day. They don't just sleep and stop. They're living organisms in your body that need constant fuel while you're sleeping. Now, they don't need as much while you're sleeping, but they need it. And so, if you again have been running on stress hormones all day long, what normally has happened is your liver, which is your primary fuel tank for carbohydrates when you're not ingesting them. So your muscles have tanks in there, but they use those independently. But your liver stores the rest for the rest of your body. And if you've been running on stress hormones all day, that liver glycogen stores is pretty low. So you're usually going to go to bed in a high stress state. So initially, carbs, if you ingest them before night, can bring those stress hormones down, helping you get into a more relaxed state. Now, that doesn't solve the problem that your tank is empty. So eventually, you might be able to get to sleep, but you might wake up in 2 or 3 hours because the tank is empty. The body's signaling, "Hey, we need carbohydrates," and it's releasing stress hormones again. So you wake up totally wired out. So the other job is we have to get that tank refilled. And that usually comes with eating enough carbs throughout the day that you have somewhat of a surplus of carbohydrates, that it starts restoring these storage units, whether it's in your muscles or in your liver. You want to store enough so that you can basically sleep through the night and the body, instead of releasing stress hormones, just starts releasing that glycogen stores throughout the night so that your body can keep running without you waking. Carbohydrates, that's what they're going to do through that process. And that's why people, if they haven't been eating and start to have sleep issues, if you, not just before night, but throughout the day, start getting them to eat more carbohydrates, they will always report that sleep is now better, deeper, and they don't wake up as much.
100%. That happened to me. And so many people every week it's like a new person. I've got people who have trouble sleeping and trying to slowly reintroduce the carbs and before bed. That's a huge factor. And even waking up in the middle of the night, because initially I would still wake up in the middle of the night and then just have a glass of orange juice or something of that sort. And it helped a lot for going back to sleep. And then relating to carbohydrates, I think this would be a great transition into digestion because a lot of times, right, we talk about the keto, the carnivore, the intermittent fasting, the low carb states where digestion's really poor. And a lot of people will report constipation and think that to be normal. And then we have an interplay of endotoxins. So do you mind kind of explaining, right? We have less energy, we have less thyroid, we're not consuming enough carbs. Now digestion is slowed. So how does that all interplay?
Yeah. It's a good question because it is interesting that a lot of people, when they go on a keto or carnivore-based diet, they actually do report better digestion, right? And a lot of them might have some autoimmune or allergies or something, and all of a sudden they report that that is better. And so we have to, and so that's why like carbs are bad, right? We think carbs are bad. And so we have to contextualize like, okay, what it can be problematic is that, your digestive system is 80% of where your immune system is. And your digestion system also works best in a restful state, in a parasympathetic state. And it doesn't work well at all in a stress state. It's one of the systems in your body that when stress gets high, digestion just stops. It's operating via the vagal nerve. It's also operating via your central nervous system, communicating to it. That's why your digestive system is like your second brain because of so many nervous system functions. It's very highly connected to the brain because the brain is where the nervous system lives. And so those two are communicating all the time. So if you are running from a lion, literally the communication is shut the digestive system down. That's non-essential. We don't need to spend extra calories digesting food. We need to get the hell out of here. Well, your body doesn't know the difference between running from a lion or a fight with your spouse or 60-hour work weeks or a hard workout. It's all thinks it's additional stress on the system. Your body will have the same biological response regardless of the stress or where it's coming from. That does not change. And that part of that biological response is going to be slow digestive system down. Now, if all of a sudden you have a slow digestive system and now you're trying to push a bunch of like high fibrous material into there or processed foods or whatever it is, right? The peristalsis or the muscular action of your digestive system is like, we're not doing anything. We're not working, right? So your doctor usually tells you just eat more fiber. And he basically is telling you to pack stuff into this system that isn't able to actually contract and move things through. But by packing stuff in there, like if you were like, if you had a tube and you started packing things in there, eventually things would come out the back end because you're just pushing them through. And that's kind of what fibrous material can do to a system. So they're now having a bowel movement, but they're probably congested all the way through their intestinal area. So what we really want to do is energize the bowel. We want the peristalsis. We want the muscular contractions to actually occur. But that takes you getting out of that stressed atmosphere and then giving the body enough fuel to have those contractions and actually support peristalsis. Well, again, what does that look like, right? Specifically, if now things have really shut down and you've been told to put all this fibrous material in there, now all that's doing is it is pushing things through. But now this stuff is sitting in your intestinal warm area for days on end, right? That's usually going to increase some sort of bacterial load. And these bacteria can produce a toxin called endotoxins. And again, that's normal. We all do produce some sort of endotoxins. We normally do excrete it through our stool. However, if we're having other issues like leaky gut, SIBO, right? That stuff can get through the intestinal lining and start creating havoc in our body, right? Travels through the blood systems and get into the cells and start to create metabolic dysfunction within our systems. And we see this in people that are diabetic or cancers. They have high amount of these endotoxins in their blood. And again, it's usually because they're in a high stress state. When you're in a high stress state, the gut usually becomes more permeable or more leaky and more things get into the blood. You see that because people also start to have more allergies, right? Things are leaking into their blood system and your system's having a response. And so again, like I said, your digestive system is 80% of where your immune system is. It's basically where your body's communicating from the outside world to the inside world. And if things start going through the intestinal lining that shouldn't get into your system, yeah, your body's going to have a response to that. So the low carb people, carnivore, keto, what their goal is, well, we're going to remove all of this fibrous material that might be irritating or impacting your GI. And what happens is it does work, right? Now you don't have all this highly irritating things into your GI system, and all of a sudden they have an improvement. The problem is those people usually report severe constipation. Now, a lot of them will take a ton of minerals and things to try to get things moving, but constipation is quite oftenly reported in those diets because now there's zero fibrous material. And so we're going from A to Z, and we got some improvements, but now we're also creating another problem. And so our thoughts are, well, yes, we'll lower the fibrous material, not completely remove it. We'll give you some that the body can, that have some beneficial properties like the raw carrot salad. But we're also going to give you carbohydrates because, again, what we're trying to do is get the body out of the stress state. What does that? Glucose. So we need to give you carbohydrates, lower the stress response, and then make sure there's enough fuel to help energize the bowel so now the bowel can actually work on its own and move things through you. And that's what's going to help decrease all of the endotoxins, bacterial load, and the body then has an opportunity to heal because now it's energized, right? Not just shoving fiber into it to fix itself. But again, everyone can be a little bit different. Some people respond really well to a low fibrous diet that's more liquid, while others, because they're pretty stressed, might be, and it could be problematic because they're also having blood sugar issues and all that liquid calories isn't going to be beneficial. So you kind of have to find the right combinations for that individual because you, like I said, you're normally not working with just one problem. There could be multiple problems, so you have to work at many different angles. But ultimately, the goal is to energize the bowel with the proper energy source, get things moving. Certainly, some fat is also beneficial because it does help with bile release and helps remove toxicities from the system. And then possibly giving them some supplements during a short period of time, whether it's magnesium or Cascara sagrada, to help move things. If somebody is in a hypothyroid state, getting them on the right thyroid medication will help them immensely. There's a lot of P3 receptors on the digestive system, and so if that is lacking, and all of a sudden they get it, that will definitely help with peristalsis.
Yeah, I can relate to all of those for sure. Cascara, super helpful. T3, of course, magnesium. Something else that I didn't realize until you emphasized it to me months ago was salt for digestion. It was measure out a tablespoon of salt, use it throughout the day. I think I was undersalting, and that increased my ability to just go to the bathroom tremendously. And I know that's one of the key anti-stress nutrients. What role does salt have in digestion?
Well, the minerals will help kind of hydrate the bowel more. So if somebody is starting to become constipated, things are sitting in there longer, specifically when it gets into the colon. Part of one of the jobs of your colon is to pull the water out, pull the minerals out, right? So that you don't have all this loose stool. If anyone's had diarrhea, basically what's happening is things are moving through your colon very, very fast. And that's why it's just coming out so wet. So again, you're the chyme gets into the food particles, gets into the colon, you want to remove those. But if you are constipated, it stays in there too long and it makes it too dry. And now you're getting pebbles, it's hard to move it. So having some of the mineral salt or magnesium helps rehydrate that and helps move things through faster. Um, and sodium is also a anti-stress kind of mineral because it helps reduce aldosterone, which is also another stress hormones and which is basically involved in our renal systems. And so that alone can be supportive to the system. And that's why even if you're going to bed, and again, calcium is another very anti-stress mineral, that a good bedtime snack is to have some sugar, a little fat, a little protein like milk, and calcium is really good for at nighttime, along with a little salt to help bring down the stress hormones and create more of that relaxed state.
For sure. And then when it comes to calcium, I think something that's really interesting is a lot of people who have, I've seen low metabolic rate, maybe hypothyroidism, maybe digestive issues, oftentimes are lactose intolerant. Maybe they can't really handle dairy. So maybe I'll talk to them about eggshell calcium or things of that sort. But what's the relationship between dairy, SIBO, endotoxin, all of that?
Well, if you're referencing like lactose,
Yes,
right?
yeah, lactose.
So dairy's the milk sugar in dairy is lactose. And for the human body, we have microvilli in our small intestine, and we produce these they're called branch border enzymes, and they're produced in basically the first 10 centimeters of your small intestine. One of the enzymes that you produce there is lactase, and that enzyme breaks down lactose. Now, if somebody is in an inflamed state and they aren't able to produce that enzyme, and that actually does happen. We even see it when people get sick, that there's enough inflammation that they actually stop producing that enzyme. That's why I think a lot of people say, hey, when you're sick, don't have milk because you're going to have all this bloating and mucus and so forth. And usually, yeah, it's because that process is going on. But usually when they get better, that improves. But you can imagine that in a pseudo stress state, that could also be affected. And so all of a sudden, everyone's like, I don't digest milk properly. Some people will say I don't digest milk properly, maybe because they just haven't consumed milk in years. And your body is very adaptive. So if you remove milk for long periods of time, yeah, you probably don't have the enzymatic production that you would have had you been drinking it the entire time. So if you choose to reintroduce, for a lot of people who believe they're lactose intolerant, a lot of times you can introduce milk or dairy very slowly, allow the body to readapt to it, and over the course of weeks or months, all of a sudden it can digest it properly. Some people do better on a raw milk because that actually does have some of the enzyme in it. And so they can tolerate maybe sheep's milk or goat's milk over cow's milk, or they'll use A2 milk. But you're, usually, if you do it slow and steady and you find the right milk for you, it can definitely be more tolerated. You'll also find as you get healthier and your metabolism does increase, you're going to tolerate it more. If someone completely doesn't tolerate it, they're like, nope, I don't, it's not working. They can do eggshell calcium like you suggest. That's certainly one option. They can also try a lactose-free milk, which is essentially regular milk with the enzyme added. So they actually don't remove the milk sugar. They actually just add the lactase enzyme to the milk. So you could actually then also buy a lactase enzyme and try and just put that into your milk and see if that helps you. Any of those can work. Or you could just try something like hard cheese, which has very little lactase in it
Mhm.
or lactose in it. So that could be another way to kind of slowly get your body more adaptive to having dairy back in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that I noticed for myself and a lot of people when we're able to increase dairy and calcium. I don't know if it's reducing the parathyroid hormone or what the exact mechanism is, but tend to feel a lot better. So it's especially having it with coffee, really helpful. And then kind of speaking of coffee and these stress hormones, something that you dove deep into in Better Energy was excess estrogen, estrogen dominance, how we can, have issues with that in our liver, uh, different tissue, and then obviously outside of our body in taking estrogen. Do you mind kind of explaining? A lot of people think just estrogen's the female hormone. Everyone needs it. Uh, a lot of people are, as you explain, estrogen dominant, have too much estrogen. Do you mind kind of explaining the role of it in men and women and why it's so prevalent of being too much in people?
Yeah. Well, this is going to be this is a whole nother can of worms
Oh, I know.
we're about to open up. Um, so for your specific audience, and I don't know how many women but for everybody,
Some,
yeah.
yeah, I think what's in for women, there's so many topics surrounding estrogen, and we've talked about it previously. But personally, I have family members who've had estrogen kind of fed cancers, and then people in my family who have been on birth control for a long period of time, or people I know who are trying to come off that have fertility issues with estrogen, rheumatoid arthritis, other things. So I think for PCOS for women, I think there's a lot of cases. And then for men, obese men who I talk to, right, having estrogen dominance, you can see that kind of in the fat distribution a lot of times initially. Uh, Maybe it's not gynecomastia exactly, but excess breast fat in men. Um, those would be kind of the cases, I suppose. Yeah.
hmm Yeah, so most of us believe estrogen is like the female hormone because it's certainly much higher in women than in men. And as a woman goes through adolescence, estrogen is higher for breast development, hip development, and then of course as she's in her child production years essentially, then you're going to have in your cycle higher levels of estrogen to basically produce your endometrial lining. And so you need estrogen obviously to produce a baby. You obviously need it also to produce very female parts of a woman's body. It doesn't mean that men don't have it. You absolutely do have it, and you do produce it. Women over their lifetime probably have 10 to 20 to up to thousands of times more exposure if they're pregnant. So we have a lot more exposure to it through our lifetime and via than men. Now, what we also know is that estrogen is also a stress hormone and that it elevates under stress. And for men and even for women, how you produce estrogen is through aromatization. So you're basically converting your androgens, DHEA and testosterone, into estrogen. And that happens at a higher rate under stress. And so predominantly as we age, for women, after we get through menopause, we produce primarily most of our estrogen in our tissue at that point. We produce some in the ovaries, a little bit in our adrenals, but predominantly it's produced in your peripheral tissues, specifically fat tissue. So if the more fat you have, usually the more estrogen you will produce, and it will stay locally within your tissue. So even if you're going to go get a blood lab, you really can't see what your tissue estrogen is. As men age and they become under more stress, they can actually have higher amounts of estrogen than their female counterpart in later years, just due to stress. And you'll see that in older men because it looks like they start to develop breast. And so, and again, that's a process that's happening in peripheral tissue, predominantly in body fat, where their androgens, testosterone, like I said, DHEA, can convert into estrogen. And that can be problematic because estrogen in and of itself is the hormone that's telling your cells to divide. And that's why it's talked about so much in certain cancers. And we know, so is it specific just to estrogen or what estrogen is telling the tissue to do in an unregulated manner? And so that's what we kind of want to pay attention to. So I talk a lot about estrogen in the book, predominantly prior to perimenopause and menopause women, because it's such a topic in that space, and certainly in that space, it's being promoted right now as basically the hormone that all women should be on, specifically in perimenopause and menopause. And I certainly don't inherently agree with that because it's more estrogen exposure. And I'm not sure most women need more estrogen exposure. And so if we look at the full body of what is happening, specifically in women that are going through perimenopause and menopause, it's usually, I see it's a downstream effect, all the symptoms they're having because the body's starting to become unregulated. And perimenopause and menopause itself is another stress on the body, which starts to create more problems that the body can't keep up with. So it's another demand. And because they're already overburdened, maybe they're not eating enough, they're specifically women who eat very low calorie, low carb diets, they start to become more symptomatic. And they, of course, then say, well, it's because estrogen's lower and now I'm not having as much estrogen. So estrogen, it must be because of the lower estrogen why all of these things are happening. And for women, the predominant thing that estrogen is being studied for and what it's prescribed for is to lower the onset of hot flashes. That's the main thing. So women will get on some sort of estrogen support. Hot flashes are much better. They start to sleep better. Their quality of life improves. They feel more regulated. So overall, they're going to have some sort of health benefit from that. Is it because they needed more estrogen, or is it what estrogen was doing? And when you take exogenous estrogen in that state, what it essentially does is it tends to dampen the alarm system. So their body's in that hyper stress state. Estrogen comes in, dampens the alarm. The alarm is lower, so they have less symptoms, but it's not actually fixing the problem. It's just dampening the alarm. However, what I like to tell people is if your alarm is going off constantly and you can't sleep and you feel miserable during the day, dampening it will have some benefits, right? Because just better sleep is going to make you have better health outcomes, regardless if it's really what you needed. What we try to do is, hey, can we get that result without putting an exogenous estrogen in you and adding to your estrogen load? Because that can be problematic in different ways. And yes, you can. Again, we're doing it by diet, lifestyle changes, and trying to get that body out of that stress signal more into that healthy metabolism space so the body's running better. But like I said, estrogen isn't just the female. Men definitely have it. Just like testosterone isn't a male hormone, women definitely have it. In fact, testosterone is the leading hormone in women's biology. It isn't estrogen, but estrogen is very, very, very powerful. You don't need a lot of it to have an impact. So like in a women's cycle, certainly, during the luteal phase, progesterone will be 100 times higher than the estrogen that's in there. And so you need a lot more progesterone to kind of offset the effects of estrogen. It's because estrogen is so very, very powerful. So again, don't need a lot of it, but for men specifically, yes, you will start to produce more of it as your biology becomes more stressed. So everything we've talked about here, us trying to get you out of that stressed physiology, as you continue to stay in it and you gain more body fat, your body will produce more peripheral estrogen in your tissue that can be very problematic. And you'll notice, like I said, that's where men start to look like they have breast. And so something that we have to consider, and it's also a reason why, yeah, having additional body fat isn't inherently beneficial to you. It's not something we want, but we want to reduce it and support it in a healthy manner, just not starve the crap out of you. Because if we do that, yes, maybe you'll lose less body fat or lose body fat, but you're also going to become more symptomatic and have other problems, sleep, energy, whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. And if somebody's trying to understand more about estrogen and there's so many different types of estrogen and the blood test for it, definitely need to read Better Energy by Kate, because this goes in depth. It's extremely helpful. Like, you can get blood labs and you can read it, or you can look at different tests that you want to get and understand what they mean, and how to go about that, how to, what foods or what practices to use to hopefully improve that. But going on this tangent of stress and the issues behind it and some of the hormones involved, I'd like to talk about how and really ask, how can an impaired energy production, increased stress, all of the things we've talked about so far, how can that affect fertility in men and women? Because I think this is a big thing for a lot of people struggling to have children. I know you've helped people with this. So, um, kind of what's going on there, and why is this such an issue for people?
Yeah. So having an overstressed system is going to affect fertility in both men and women. Certainly, we know in today's society, actually, sperm production is much, much lower. It's definitely having a negative effect. And infertility is problematic. And that's why there's fertility clinics everywhere. And a lot of it is that, yeah, people's systems aren't healthy. And your body doesn't want to procreate or put that massive demand of producing a baby on your system if you can't sleep, or you can't get through the day, or if you are dieting, or if you're trying to over exercise. The body's like, mm-mm. Like, we're not going to do that now. It could just be that your entire hormonal cycle has been shut down because under stress, when we activate our hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. So within your system, you have a lot of what we refer to as axes, and they're hormonal or endocrine systems that are communicating with each other. And a lot of them come from your hypothalamus, which was again in your brain. Then they're going to communicate to your pituitary, and then they will communicate to different endocrine organs throughout your body. Most people know about hypothalamus pituitary adrenals, that kind of axis is communicating each other, and that's your stress axis. And when that is elevated, another axis decreases, which is called your hypothalamus pituitary gonads. It's ovaries for women, testes for men. And so it's literally going to tell that system to shut down. So for a lot of women, that's why they might lose their cycle entirely, or it becomes really erratic. Maybe they have really heavy bleeding, they have a lot of symptoms, right? None of that is normal. I mean, it's normal in the sense that most women have it, but it's not normal in the sense that that's what you should be experiencing. And that's a symptom of something not being supported properly. And so, again, we have to go back into, is there excessive amount of demands on the system? And we're using too much of the energy you're producing to kind of meet those external demands. And it's compromising your internal systems. One of those that, again, is non-essential for you to survive is your all the sex hormone productions. Body's like, we don't need to have that. We'll get rid of the cycle, right? It's not essential. We're going to slow your libido down. Don't need to procreate. They don't have the energy to make a baby or sperm or any of that. And it makes absolute sense that that would happen because we just don't have the resources. And so is it like that everyone's just becoming completely infertile, or literally do we have an epidemic of systems that are in a hyper stress state, in a low thyroid state, or underfueled or undernutrient or whatever it is, and we aren't able to keep up with that demands, and the body's just adapting. Your system is incredibly smart. And again, if we had to think about everything our body was doing, we would just be overwhelmed with everything that's going on at every second of the day. You have 37 trillion cells that are constantly creating energy and doing things to support your system. But there's all that communication, and you have all of these hormone communication accesses that are constantly talking to each other and saying, they're doing way too much. That woman or that man is going to start running and training for a marathon right now, and they're going to run for 6 to 7 hours. We're not going to have a cycle anymore. Or we're going to he's going to have zero sex drive because he just doesn't have it available. And I hear it all the time with couples, right? And you start to see that they're you start to see it in women that look particularly healthy, but they're overtraining, underfueling, and they're like, I can't get pregnant. And I'm like, yeah, I understand why. You're totally crashing your system out. And the same thing with a male, because a lot of type A people, they're extreme athletes and they push them systems, they work hard, they play hard. And a lot of times they just crash their entire testosterone levels because, again, the body's going to be under duress. A lot of that testosterone could be just be producing estrogen. If you've ever gone to watch a marathon and seen people that are running, unless like the elite athletes, you're all super lean and thin. But as you move through that people, you're starting to go, everyone here has a little bit of a belly. A lot of the guys do. Some of them have the man boobs, and they don't look particularly fit. And it's because, again, they've pushed their systems, and they could be eating the wrong diet, but they've hyper stressed their systems. They've probably been burning through muscle tissue. Maybe they haven't eaten enough or eaten enough carbohydrates. And now their body's creating this adaptive response, which apparently doesn't even look that healthy. So when we start to look at everything and manage those kind of two systems and constantly ask ourselves, hey, what could be contributing to the state I'm in? And then kind of looking at your life and going, okay, well, let's see, I work 10 hours a day, I train 2 hours a day, I'm super stressed at home, I have 2 kids, and I'm trying to diet right now. And then they're like, I don't know, I can't get pregnant, right? Well, that's the answer right there. And so then you have to consider what's important to you at the time, because we have to create a physiology that will be able to have a baby. If we don't have a physiology,
Second.
when you
Okay, we're back. Sorry about that.
so tell me exactly where we were so I don't have to repeat
Yes.
myself.
Yep. You were talking about a woman who's stressed, all these things going on, trying to diet, but then she realizes she needs to change some things to get pregnant.
Yeah. So, like I said, ultimately, infertility from our perspective is an energy issue. There's no huge epidemic going on. It's literally for most individuals, not all, but for most, and certainly the people I've worked with, if we kind of regulate and again decrease demands while improving nutrition, over time, we're going to create a body that is capable of producing a human, right? And again, so we have to create that physiology first. Now, are there going to be people that are totally unhealthy that can still produce a baby? 100%, right? There's always situations where this happens. Is that baby going to be super healthy? Probably not. Probably going to have some problems, right? But we want to produce a healthy baby that's going to do well. And so we want to make sure that the woman that baby's being developed in is as healthy as possible, and the nutrients and everything are supported so that they have a good pregnancy, and the body of the baby is going to be as healthy as possible. Because we have to understand, we don't just pass on our genetics to the baby, we also can pass on how well our cells work. And if our cells aren't functioning properly, then that baby can very well come out already in a deficient state. And, I think that's something that we can see within people that maybe they're really, really heavy or maybe not very well. And the child usually also has problems.
Absolutely. And on this topic of kind of the marathon running male who's got the man boobs, the woman who's and the men who can't have children, something that tends to be a commonality that at least I've seen is hair health is lacking, especially for women, but men too, especially when they're young, and skin as well. So how does this, I mean, this is again related to the energy, but do you mind explaining kind of the mechanisms behind the energy uh, and the metabolism with hair and skin? Because many people struggle with issues that you mentioned in
Yeah.
your book.
Now, I will say things like hair, some of that can be very genetic.
Hmm.
Some men you would see lose their hair when they're 20. And and certainly as women go through menopause, you can also see thinning of hair and hair loss. And now, again, that could be definitely an energy issue. It also can be there is a genetic component to hair loss. But as we've talked about, hair is a non-essential, like the growth of your nails, good skin, hair is all non-essential. So we definitely see when people you can see when people go into severely caloric restrictions that they're usually their hair all falls out.
Hmm.
Or if someone is highly, highly stressed, their hair can fall out. So we go, okay, your body is not going to prioritize hair growth when it doesn't have enough energy to run its nervous system or to run its circulatory system. It's just going to be like, we aren't going to be dealing with that. And so now hair does need and skin, they both need an exorbitant amount of nutrition uh, to turn over properly and grow. So we always have to make sure the proper nutrition is there. And that can be copper and B vitamins and iron, zinc, calcium. All of those are very essential for hair growth. Um, so we look at a lot of different mechanisms as far as what is going on. Now, skin, particularly because it's part of your immune system and it's very related to your gut health. So if someone has a very permeable gut or leaky gut, you might see a lot more rashes on them. You might see a lot more issues with their skin, acne, and so forth, if the gut is kind of you got gut dysbiosis. So for that kind of thing, you would address their GI and see if that does improve it. A lot of times it could be a lack of vitamin D. Your skin is very responsive to things like D. And so we kind of want to look through a lot of different mechanisms and nutrients to see if, hey, how can we make these improvements? But like anything that is not totally related to you having to survive, it's always going to take a hit when you don't produce energy effectively. Again, is that true to every single person? It is not. There are always these kind of unicorns out there that are like completely unhealthy and have a magnificent head of hair, right? You see them. And so
That was me.
it always can happen. And, so there then a genetic component? Because I've also seen people that are very, very, very healthy and do all the things right and have no hair, specifically in men. And so, we do have to weigh. There always is some level of genetic component that does occur in these kind of states. But for most part, usually you can improve, specifically with women, as they kind of go through that kind of change of life, that we can improve their health and nutrition, and usually their hair will also improve.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot behind the nutrition aspect, and maybe that's a future episode because the beef liver, the oysters, there's so many important things. But as we kind of come to a close, one of my last questions that I really wanted to kind of just pick your brain about, we haven't talked about it, and you mentioned it in your book a little bit, is degenerative brain disease. And now this is something for like myself and a lot of people watching who played football, had a lot of head impacts. They're probably thinking about this. Now, we've talked about CO2, bag breathing, even progesterone possibly post impact. I know Dr. Ray Peat talked about that, even in like car accidents to use it for people. So, what are some steps that people can use, whether they're older women who I know are afraid of Alzheimer's? I know that runs in my family for women, or men who've took a lot of hits to the head, worried about CTE, Alzheimer's. What can we do about that?
Well, I think first you're going to have to like state your brain runs on glucose. That's its
Yes.
primary fuel source. And so That's how your brain fuels. That's how the entire system works in there. Now, again, it can run on ketones. Now, if someone is under a significant amount of stress, you do become a poor glucose oxidizer. We see that in diabetics. And
Mhm.
that's why sometimes dementia is or Alzheimer's are referred to as diabetes 3, because you're having poor glucose oxidation, the brain can't get properly fueled, and parts of the brain start to die. And that's problematic. And sometimes in those individuals, it's not a matter of just trying to give them more carbohydrates. It's a matter of trying to fix the system to improve the glucose oxidation. And that's a little bit of a process. It's certainly not avoiding them. Now, we definitely know there's some studies where people are, start consuming coconut oil or things that can be almost metabolized like carbohydrates, but are not carbohydrates. And those can fuel the brain appropriately because they're probably producing some level of ketones with the lauric acid from the coconut oil. But ultimately, you want to work on improving carbohydrate metabolism. That is going to be one of the primary things you want to do. Now, if you actually have an injury and other things, then again, you want to do everything to support your body in the healing process. And healing is a part of it. If you have high energy production, then you're going to heal more appropriately. If you're in a low energy state, then healing is going to be much slower. Healing from anything increases, again, the demands on your body, right? Whether you have the flu or a broken bone or whatever, the demands, your body needs more everything. It needs more energy because then all of a sudden you have to rebuild that bone or fight off an infection. And so that's one of the reasons why you have a spike in temperature when you have a fever, because demands are increasing. So anytime rest is very important at those times. And because again, if you're out there, you have an injury and all of a sudden you're pushing your body really hard, guess what again is going to happen? The energy you're producing is going to be used for those external things and it's not going to be used for healing. And we need the body to heal. And so rest is usually a pretty big component, trying to get your calories up, making sure you're consuming enough carbohydrates, right? The brain runs on glucose. It prefers that as its fuel source. If you're having issues, if somebody is diabetic, then that's kind of another conversation. But diabetes isn't a matter that glucose is creating the problem. The problem is your cells are unable to utilize glucose fast enough. And so there's something blocking it, either from getting into the cell or it's not moving through the cell fast enough and you're getting a backup. And that backup is ending up in your blood and you're showing up as high blood sugar. And again, something similar can happen within the brain, meaning you're having a usage issue. And so we have to address that very differently. First, you have to address, are you getting the right nutrition to help move glucose through the cell? And or is there a high amount of endotoxins? Because endotoxins can block this whole production issue. Is there too much polyunsaturated fat in the diet or in the blood, or is that being released? Because that can inhibit the process. Is there excess amount of estrogen production? Because that can inhibit the process. Is there a low thyroid going on? Because if it is, that will inhibit the process. Do we have enough nutrition? That will inhibit it. And so there's a multitude of things. If you aren't breathing appropriately, someone has something COPD or is anemic and they're not producing or traveling, don't have enough oxygen, that will inhibit the process. Anything that can inhibit energy production and it makes the process slower, meaning you are unable to keep up with your demands because your system can't produce energy fast enough, will tell your body that we need more. And so that means it's going to create a stress response. So it's going to perpetuate that entire cycle, right? And what do we know? We know that glucose is a faster fuel source than fat. So we want to try to use glucose. We know that thyroid is needed to kind of speed that process up. We know that certain nutrients are needed to make that entire process happen. We know that we definitely need oxygen for that process. And again, all the things we talked about that it can inhibit that, we have to look at all of those things. But inherently, if you start to look at blood sugar issues or dementia as an energy issue, then we can start to correct the problem and not just kind of fingers crossed. Because right now, we don't have a lot of answers for Alzheimer's or dementia. We don't have any good remedies at this point in time. Right now, in the menopausal world, is being promoted to use estrogen that could be brain protective or neuroprotective. And there's zero evidence in randomized controlled trials that show that this is true. If anything, we actually see more negatives with people that are on hormone replacement. But yes, specifically, if we did an observational trial with women and we ask women who are on hormones or look at women who are on hormones and we observe them against women who are not on hormones, we see better results with the women on hormone. But those aren't telling us causation, they're just a correlation. Because what we do know is that women who do take hormones are usually healthier to begin with. They are usually more proactive. They usually have higher incomes and education and so forth. And if we're comparing it to women who cannot take hormones, they'll usually have blood clot issues, cancer issues, and so forth. It doesn't mean that the estrogen is being protective. It just means that they're actually starting at a lower level. And that's why that becomes more problematic. And they've already had a lot of stress or other things that are creating problems in their life. So it's not an equal comparison. But what I can say is, on a mechanistic level, estrogen in numerous levels can block energy production. And so if we kind of take that into consideration and see how it works in the bigger picture, then we understand that maybe more is not better, that maybe we have to go a different route to support the system, and that's not maybe the best option for, I would say most, but at least some individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, the estrogen and all of these things you're talking about in better energy and how to heal your metabolism, it's outlined so well. And you go over like the question that somebody would ask, and then you use the analogies, factory workers and all these different types of people, which I think really helped me kind of analogize the science behind it. But either way, the last question I have before we finish up is, after everything you've learned through your own health journey, studying Ray Peat and others like Gilbert Ling, Hans Selye, other people, writing your own books, what do you believe is still the most misunderstood part about health currently?
I think part of it is like, are we ever going to be able to cure things like cancer or cure things like dementia or, when they work in these genetic components? Um, because the basis is, and where I think most medical and even health people get it wrong, is they aren't looking at it through an energy production issue. And they aren't differentiating between a stress metabolism and a healthy thyroid supported metabolism. They're just basically lumping it all together and going, producing, burning more calories. It means you have a higher metabolism, and that's good. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. And I think that we have to really individualize people in the sense because, physiology is actually quite similar in a healthy person to all people. What's different is where that individual is starting and the current symptoms that they're experiencing. And based on where they initially are, their path is going to be very different than somebody else, meaning what may work for you could be detrimental to them depending on the state that they're at, right? Like where you are, you can, consume 4,000 to 6,000 calories. But if somebody else started in that space, it would make them overweight, could make them diabetic, it could make them totally off, right? So we have to take that every story, these anecdotal stories are important so that you can kind of understand that there is a process and people can make it through. But your individual process is going to be different. And that's why it's so important to understand the physiology behind it. And although some people are like, oh, it's like so much, it's like, and it is. And that's why I really try to break it down and I talk in analogies the whole way through. But the more we understand ourselves, then we actually won't get like pulled away to all these different dietary approaches and like all these new shiny supplements and all of these things that we're being told by every health influencer or medical person because you are being pulled in 100 different directions right now and it can be overwhelming. And so we end up just trying to grab a thing here and grab a thing there. But if we understood our physiology better and understood how does this work, so that now I can make more educated decisions about myself, so that now I don't get pulled in 40 different directions, and now I can go, oh, you know what? Why am I not sleeping well? Okay, what's going on in my life? Oh, I got some really bad news. Oh, I forgot to eat dinner tonight, and whatever. And so instead of freaking out and being like, "Oh my God, I need to go to the doctor," you can go, "You know what? Let me make sure I take care of myself tomorrow and prepare and eat my food and really try to go to bed earlier." And then I can go, "Okay, that seemed to work for me." And so I guess it's just a matter of like nobody has all the answers. If we did, we would all be healthy and cured. It's all of a process. And I think the more you can spend time in understanding your body and what things mean, your body doesn't lie to you. So, like when you're hungry, it means something. When you're craving sugar, it means something. It doesn't mean you're a sugar addict, right? When you're craving salt, it means something, right? It means you probably need some salt. Um, it's just what kinds are you giving yourself and what are the proper amounts, right? And so when we do understand these things, everything becomes, in my opinion, less stressful because we know how to respond to them without panicking, freaking out, going into these like social media deep dives and getting even more confused at the other end of things. And, that to me is problematic because ultimately I don't think there is inherently any bad food out there. There are better foods, but you should be able, when a healthy person, be able to pretty much have anything on some level and be totally fine. Do you want to eat some of these foods all the time? Absolutely not. But, we need to get away from creating fear around everything and just allowing people to live, but we've created a kind of food desert of nutrients with too much food availability, which has led people to pick, poor options, which has kind of led them to have poor health. And now they're not sure how to get out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, now after listening to you for the past 2 hours and hopefully checking out your books, again, Better Energy, How to Heal Your Metabolism. You also have a recipe book, which is awesome. I've used some pancake recipes and other things on there. So people should check that out. You can find all of Kate's books on www.katedeering.com, on Amazon, audiobooks on Audible, and you said Better Energy on Audible's coming out, I think, in the next week or two,
Two
or
days.
July 1st, 2 days.
Yeah. So by
Okay.
by the time you put this out, it'll be out.
But yeah, again,
Mm.
yeah. So Kate, um, again, thank you so much for coming on. Kate's changed my life. I went to for years, went to a million specialists and spent a ton of money and couldn't figure out how to get healthy. And then after reading your work, listening to a podcast, reading your work, and then working with you, you completely changed my life around. So if anyone is looking for help, absolutely reach out to Kate because you've changed my life. So thank you, Kate.
Well, you are a very good student and you're passing it forward. So, this is all I can ask for. And it's been a pleasure to chat with you and work with you.
Thank you. All right, everybody. We'll see you next time.